This is Kenya's the number one opera in the world, according to Thorin. You're watching Thorin channel, that are also known as the number one existence fan in the world.
Gamer Subs is my MVP of energy formulas. It's the longest lasting without being dodgy, unlike Russell Westbrook's rebounds in 2017. It's got the nicest calm down, really smooth, unlike, the contrast with how Rush's career ended in the LCS when he went to Cloud9. It's got substance behind it. It's not just about flair only, so that would be a pretty sharp contrast to how Kirby's game developed over the years. And you can get money off, something no one will ever be able to say about Simple or ZWoo. You can use the code Thorin, Thorin, for 10% off your order at gamersubs.gg. And by the way, let's just see what's coming in the future with that. Interesting things. The Most Valuable Player, or MVP award, is one of the most prestigious and important individual awards in any team discipline. In fact, in a lot of team disciplines, when people discuss the greatest player of all time, it is, along with championships, one of the first metrics people will invoke. History will remember the winner of the Most Valuable Player award as the best player or the best performing player in that tournament and at that specific time, despite the fact there are so many considerations that may only loosely be correlated to who wins the award and who wins the tournament and who maybe was actually the best. So it seems simple to understand what the MVP is, but I actually think esports has gone awry with how this award is decided, in a similar fashion to a lot of popular sports, and its impact is not insignificant on how history will remember these players, and more importantly, the players who didn't win the MVP award. So the MVP terminology, the most valuable player, the issue largely seems centered around the middle word, valuable. Obviously, there is a massive amount of subjectivity and preference baked into that term. The simplest and most colloquial way to say valuable would be best, right? Hence why, no matter the criteria people use in voting, it does seem as though people do always just look back and think, that was the best player. They might even say the best player instead of just MVP. In their mind, he must have been the best. So, for example, Rush was the best player, the jungler of Team Impulse Tip, in LCS Season 5 Summer on the basis that he won this award. Kirby was the best player at E-League Atlanta 2017 when Astralis won that major on the basis of this award. Russell Westbrook was the best player in the NBA regular season of 2017 on the basis of being given this award. That is what the list looks like. That's how people will say it. That's how people think of it, no matter how they come to weigh it up and decide it in their arguments in the moment, in that season, in that time. And that's why as time goes by and you forget the reasons, it's so key to nail this. Now, I obviously selected 3 pretty questionable cases there in history that you can make a lot of arguments around. But the point is, history, and a lot of fans who didn't watch that era, all the nephews out there, will remember that person simply as the MVP and colloquially, aka probably the best player, probably the guy who's performing the best overall. For most people, including the media who now issue such awards, MVP and most valuable means a bunch of different things. Oftentimes, when they feel like it, confirmation bias. Traditionally, at least for modern day figures, MVP was the best player on the team who won the championship, the title, or the trophy. That's still commonly how it works in CS, Counter-Strike, in the NBA finals when they're awarding the MVP of the finals, minus a single year, most famously the first year they introduced the award, 1969, when Jerry West was just so absurdly good for the Lakers, they actually gave it to him that one time, and never again has a losing player ever been able to win it, as everyone knows from the 2015 season when Iguodala somehow won it for the Warriors, which is fairly questionable, right? Famously, in Counter-Strike, though, there have been players who were able to break the mold. The 2 big ones, because they were just the ultimate god carries, even when their team wasn't the best, were obviously Simple, the greatest player of all time, and Kenny S, who at that point in time, I think, had the greatest peak ever seen in CSGO. But actually, there's a number of other players who have also won as the losing player in the final, such as Twists from Team Liquid. You had, that was obviously at ESL New York in 2018. You had Flamey at the second ESL Pro League finals. You had ZWoo, that actually happened a couple of times. It was at ClearSL Cologne, for example, the one that Team Liquid won the Grand Slam at. You had Electronic, I actually forget what tournament that was, but he had one where he won when they were second place or something. The longer the tournament goes, the less sense it actually makes to give someone on the winning team the MVP by default, unless it's a finals MVP award. The logic goes, if you were the most valuable though, why didn't your team win? Well, that ignores a million factors that contribute to winning and sometimes can be the primary component, right? Like it ignores, what about everyone didn't have an equally good team? It's a team sport. What about every player doesn't play an equally impactful role or impactful role in their team? Or what about decision making? A player on your team makes a bad decision, it makes you lose a game that you otherwise would have won when you perform phenomenally. Classic example being when Simple won the MVP on the losing team at Star Series Season 4. I think maybe the best performance ever in Counter-Strike, but he was on the losing team because Zeus and Edward just decided they didn't want to win that day, and Zeus barely did do something, did he? So then how about this? What about your leader or your coach makes a bad call, leader of the coach of the other team makes a good call? Doesn't that decide games? Doesn't that win games? By the way, you could decide a whole final from small outplays from players on the winning team who will never win the MVP award and aren't even going to be considered the most valuable. They aren't even the best player on that team. But somehow that determines that you can't win when you might have played the best out of everyone in the final because you didn't win the final. What about teams, by the way, who win off tactics or teamwork, so not about just skill and fragging, etc., or teams that are just really even across the board, don't always have one player carrying? Classic examples: Astralis 2018, Fnatic 2015, Mouse Sports 2018, FaZe 2022. These are all Counter-Strike examples. You could obviously go back in history. There's times when TSM had super teams in the LCS. There's times when G2 had super teams in the LEC. You can go across the board and through many different games, you'll get these scenarios, right? Similarly, players like Rush and Arrow in the LCS, Niski in the LEC, they weren't the best players in terms of them being on the best team in the league or the tournament. So then you have the people who can win when they're not the best. And oftentimes the narrative there isn't, well, they're the best. The narrative becomes wins over replacement. People love this terminology. I personally despise it. The logic goes, if you replaced that player with some sort of a league average player at their position, whatever role they play, then did that to all the other candidates, whose team would win the least games, that's your MVP. Now, there is a kind of a logic to that, but I think it has a key flaw, and I have the reason I have a preference against it. I think it massively skews the award to teams who are not the best. In fact, I think whereas the other one's like, well, whoever the best on that team is must be the MVP. This goes almost the other way. It goes, who has the absolute worst team that this guy playing really well could somehow get like sort of the more games than they should, but even then maybe not the most games. So a flaw there is the contrast is too crazy between the two, and there's no real middle overlap, and they're too extreme, but they obviously infer something about each other. Obviously, you could be incredible on a bad team and way better than the guy who wins, but you could also be like really, really good on a super awful team, but not as good as a godlike player on also not the best team, but a really good team. These things, you could win in dominant fashion if you're on that team. Like in this scenario, just barely winning would make you the absolute best as the absolute godlike player, whereas being a really, really amazing, super excellent player on an awesome team that didn't win as well, in this scenario, you're caught between the two, aren't you? You don't really get to win in the same kind of way. So there's a massive flaw, I think, overall. So in this split in the LEC, you would have said Misfits would have been the team in that position. They could have given Vethio or VTO the MVP for that reason. Obviously, that is the reason why Rush won on tip in LCS Season 5 summer. That is the reason why Russell Westbrook got to win on the Thunder in 2017, although then I don't think that makes sense compared to like Harden on the Rockets, for example, or maybe even, well, let's not get into that. Now, in those splits, LEC, G2 and MAD had better players overall, and thus an individually better performance wouldn't have the same impact in that regard, right? Unless you just won by even more games. But again, you flip the criteria. Someone on Team Liquid or CLG in a similar spot in Season 5 summer of LCS had a better team, had better teammates. I think Harden on the Rockets had better teammates and was maybe a better player. Isaiah Thomas probably fits the criteria even better than Russell Westbrook, but was on the Celtics. And LeBron might even just been the best player in the NBA and was on a very good team, the Cavs, but they weren't the best team in the NBA. Therefore, people like, he can't be because they weren't on there. And then let's go down the other end and wow, what's Russell Westbrook doing with his stats? And so we went with all that fuckery. The worst version of this, in my opinion, is when they do a pure 1-for-1 with a past season, as though that is wins over replacement, and then say, right, that shows that he's the best. Because a classic example was when people were trying to big up Scottie Pippen when it was the season he got to take over from Michael Jordan in 1994, when they'd won the 3 championships, then Michael Jordan retired, maybe because of what happened with his dad, maybe because of, snake eyes. Well, that'd be you lose, but which apparently he did a lot. So that could have also been the reason why, right? The reason why that never worked is what they would always say is that one line they'd go, how come the Bulls lost the greatest player of all time and they only lost 2 games extra the next season? Doesn't that mean like he wasn't even... No, because the reason why that's whack is what they always ignore in all these season examples like that, or when you just change the team, is you're in a different time period now, playing against slightly different teams that have the foreknowledge of what happened before. Your players might be older, their players might have reached age. On this particular team, by the way, they had, let me see what it was, I think it was something like 6 different players joined the team that weren't there when Michael Jordan was there. So you had players that were actually players that were important players, like Steve Kerr, the shooter. You had Pete Myers, who actually was the replacement shooting guard for Michael Jordan. You had Tony Kukoc, one of the best European players. You had Luke Longley, who played the role of centre. You had Corey Blunt, who, yes, was just some bench guy, and there's some Johnson guy who was also in that scenario. Notice it also, by the way, that argument, and this argument wins over replacement, ignores that good teammates elevate stars, but at the same time, really bad teammates with a good player make the player look even better just by inference, when he might not actually be better than the player on the better team. By the way, the idea that good teammates elevate stars, even star players, is also the argument against just the winning team must be the one with the MVP, right? Now, usually these are the 2 methods used. What they tend to do is they look at the winning team, you probably should start there, and they decide, is there an MVP there? And if someone really popped off and stats-wise look good and they wouldn't dominate fight, then that guy just wins anyway, and you don't even continue the discussion. But if there's not anyone that impressive over there, or maybe the team that won was a surprise, then what you do is you go down and you look and you see, right, that wasn't enough, or, someone was saying stats-wise outshot him, or there's a cool argument, though, that like this guy shouldn't really have won, or maybe he's like a legendary player, and then that's the wins over replacement player, and he gets to win otherwise. That tends to be how it is. Best team, best player, or wins over replacement. That's what you go and do, right? I notice in most of these games, role is often ignored, unless it's a third primary reason to give someone the award. So, for example, in Counter-Strike, entries and supports have it the hardest. I would say in League of Legends, I mean, top laners just never win anyway, but unless it's LCK. But I would say jungles and supports obviously have a very, very hard time. Now, to be fair, though, in most of these games, that's justifiably so. Like in Counter-Strike, yeah, oftentimes you have to think they are the one who isn't doing the most, but they might be doing the thing that's the hardest in context. If you can't understand the difference between that, I'd have to make entire videos just explaining basic English words and concepts to you. But you can get the concept there, right? Something could be incredibly hard. That's a support sometimes is in most of these games. But it doesn't mean you're doing the most for the team. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to not include or to include in-game leaders when we can't really know what they're doing, but we're trying to infer it, right? That basically, by the way, was often the argument given against Device in Astralis. They'd say, well, Dupree has to entry still, doesn't he? And Magus has to lock down those CT bomb sites, and then Glaive frags out way better than most IGLs. And you know what? Zipnix has left. The guy's like a computer. He's a genius who's just winning all these rounds. You should never get, a bit like Perfecto does now. The problem always went, for me, without Device doing what he did do in that tournament, they don't win most of those tournaments. Or if they do, it's way closer, or maybe even someone like a Simpler as he was actually the better player in the tournament. That was often the reason why I actually gave Device a lot of those MVPs, and by the way, he didn't win them all. Then also consider, people used to say against Device, and this is another thing they'll say against champions, like, oh, in certain roles, like, you get kills for easy stuff. Right, here's the problem with that logic, right? If you're just like eco-fragging or low-buy cleanups in CSGO, this isn't 1.6. They don't just have Glocks. You can't just spray them all down easily. That's still really hard to get 3 kills, 4 kills, 5 kills when they're rushing to a Tech 9s, and one has an AK, and one has a Galil, and a Mac 10. Like, those are really hard rounds to clean, even if they're just all Tech 9s and body armor, and a nade or a flash or something. That's actually very valuable also to clean that up. It's not the most valuable thing, but we've got to consider it in it so it doesn't count against you. That's where it starts to get really whack when people are coming up with these awards. Because I think most people just pick who they like and had a good enough performance they can justify it, and then they construct any argument they want. You notice I try to figure out my overall principles and hierarchy of values in the game, and then I look with that lens and filter applied to the tournament. Right, he probably wins. And sometimes that means I have to give it to someone I don't even think is my favourite player or the best player. And sometimes my favourite player is slightly worse, but that's the criteria that I'm using, right? So I would say, for example, a very underrated performance, especially in context of what's going on now. Just go and look at Config's performance in his first tournament for Astralis at the Blast Fall Finals 2021. For an entry, guys, I largely judge just off killing, not even differential because of the role you're playing. This is absurd. This is one of the greatest land performances ever. That guy has unfucking believable aim and skills, and you saw it in that tournament. They had no business going as far as they did. How about when Dupree did win it over Device at ESL Pro League, what was it, season 5? It's either season 5 or 7. I'm going to say 5. I think it was one of the first ones they won in Astralis. He had a similar rating to Device, and by the way, he didn't even carry the final. Device did. But you look at his rating over the tournament, and you look who they're playing, and you look at what he has to do. That's absurd for an entry to put up the numbers he did and to do the things he did with the eye test in the game. Now, you might ask yourself, as they always do, when they have no fucking argument left, or they don't like your argument, or they can't understand it, why is it such a big deal? Right? Not only will history remember you as the best player or the best performer, but this award is not an individual award when you award it like that. It's not a team award, but you're making it a team award. You're using team metrics and placing as a primary factor. Now, there's only one context that makes sense, which is tournaments. It's very different than the NBA, where you play the same number of regular season games. In tournaments, yeah, there is obviously some correlation between the sample size and how well someone can perform. And it's easier on a smaller sample size, potentially, depending on what team you're on, obviously, or who you play in the tournament. So one of the factors I will say you got to add in that regard is if you play more matches over the tournament versus better opponents, in theory, you're going to have a better chance to show you absolutely are the best. And if you have better numbers on that, maybe you were better, right? Now, that's obviously only like semi-loosely correlated, but sometimes, in fact, oftentimes it will be strongly correlated. It just won't be always perfectly correlated, right? I will say, this is where actually the bracket you get could potentially fuck you, which could mean weird group stage games that have nothing to do with you, could ruin you, but this is also why it's a tough award. There isn't an obvious answer. That's why we're weighing it all up, right? So that's why for me, in most tournaments that have like a decent amount of rounds, yeah, obviously I would say semis is probably the cut-off point for where someone can win this award. Probably should be in the final, depending on the bracket. And then if possible to win, yeah, that would be great. That would make it nice and easy for everyone. But the key thing is it's an individual award. The best team wins the trophy, in theory. The best individual is supposed to win the MVP. This is supposed to be another way to celebrate greatness. It's actually why, if you go back in the day in sports like the NBA, I thought they did a great job of giving it to the actual best player. Oftentimes the players used to vote back then. So people like a Wilt Chamberlain or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, they would win the award, Larry Bird or whatever. The problem, obviously, as you go on, is then you get to time periods where different factors come into play, and different concepts. And like one thing I actually do think, even though they tend to still make you have to have a really good record in the NFL. I think actually the NFL All-Pro and MVP are also very good generally. All-Pro particularly, it seems like one of the best awards of all time in terms of how fairly it's actually distributed and to the right player, regardless of some of these other contexts. So I want to now introduce some other angles and ways of thinking of it, some ways I frame it. So my context, and I'll use language and terminology to attack this first. This is one thing I think other people have taken for granted. Nowhere do these MVP awards say most valuable player of Astralis, TSM, Na'Vi, FaZe. The MVP award, most valuable player award, if you actually look at the title, by definition is the most valuable player of, insert the tournament, the E-League Atlanta Major, the International 5 in Dota, the National Basketball Association in the season of 2016 to 2017, or the League of Legends Championship Series, the LCS in Season 5 Summer Split. It's the MVP, most valuable player of the whole league. Therefore, actually, how your team did might not even be that contextually important, because we're asking who was the most valuable in the whole league, not just for your team or in a specific match, right? It's not about how good your team is, or how well your general manager worked in the off-season, or how much money your org has to buy your teammates, or how good your teamwork or your teammates' teamwork is, or how smart your coach is, or how shrewd your in-game leader is, or how many wins someone else would get in your shoes but that didn't get those, or how hard your role is and how tough you have it, whether you're the best or not. It's about who the most valuable player overall is in that tournament season split. So essentially, it is the de facto best player. Now, another way I'd frame it, you'll notice that's always been my consistent position in general. Another way to frame it would be this. If we watched the entire league, the entire tournament, the entire split, And the next day, every player in it was entered into a draft. And we each take turns to draft a player. The rule being, it's not about playing the same split over. It's not about starting a franchise that goes forever and the youth. And it's not about marketability. It's not about how legendary they are and what they did in the past. It's not about what their peak was in different seasons. It's who would you pick with the first pick? Essentially, that's probably your MVP because you're starting over with all the players and not going to be in the same teams. And so you're saying, right, to have the best chance to win, this is who I take first. Now, there is a caveat that obviously then you can have some tricky elements, right? Of like, oh, but then if Xyp9x is the best support, like I take Xyp9x, so even if you take Simple and he takes Nico, then maybe I take Ziwu. And so I've still got like Xyp9x and Ziwu, but then you've got like, who have you got? Like NBK, I'm talking about different eras here. You could do that, yes, there's obviously a bit of strategy. That's why it doesn't work perfectly. So how about this? What if in this scenario, you actually just say, forget taking turns drafting. You have every player in the whole league, no language, none of those considerations. Just pick your 5 starters at the different positions and roles. You can take any players, but it's not about teamwork. Maybe you limit them to like 2 or 3 per team so they can't just pick the whole team and say, I pick the team that won or whatever. Then which player do you take first? Because in that scenario especially, that is surely the most valuable player by your metric. In theory, the best player right now in that particular tournament. Now, don't worry. I will in future videos address certain past MVP. I'm doing the narrative mechanics series. I know that I think we're an injustice. I am the esports historian. I'll try and correct some of those gross miscarriages of justice, or when people went too far with a media narrative, or they just didn't like someone, like actually happened apparently to people like Wilt Chamberlain at times. Because all MVPs are not created equal. HLTV.org. This video was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Hades GOUD, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Jensen Goh, Kovacevicd, Pacy, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Thooorin, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask a question in one of those monthly AMAs where sometimes I roast people? Do you want teasers to find out who the guests are for upcoming shows and interviews I'm doing? Maybe you want to be part of one of those cool, lengthy esports discussions that I have. Well, if any of those perks sound tantalizing to you, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today, where? Via the Patreon link in the description box below.